Well, welcome everybody today to ICMDA webinars, and today's topic is COVID-19 antivirals and vaccines. What prospects? And to speak to us about this, we've got Dr. Andy Riordan, who I will introduce very shortly. I'm Dr. Peter Saunders, the CEO of ICMDA, which brings together 80 groups of Christian doctors and dentists, national groups all around the world, with the aim of being a Christian witness through doctors and dentists in every community and in every nation. So it's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Andy Riordan. Andrew is a consultant in pediatric infectious diseases and immunology at Alder Hey Christian Hospital and an honorary clinical lecturer at the University of Liverpool in the UK. And he's been an associate editor of Archives of Disease in Childhood since 2007 and was a member of the UK's Joint Committee for Vaccination and Immunisation from 2008 to 2018. So he's eminently qualified to speak to us today on this subject, and we're delighted to have you, Andrew, and I'll hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Peter, for that introduction. COVID-19, antivirals and vaccines. Before talking about any drugs or vaccines, then I just need to declare any interest. My main interest to tell you is that I'm a children's doctor, so haven't seen as many cases of COVID-19 as others, although we did have adults with COVID-19 on our pediatric intensive care unit because we had so many cases. So we've managed 11 or 12 adults as well as the children we see. As Peter says, I work for Archives of Disease in Childhood. So if I've rejected one of your papers, I'm very sorry. We do get sent a lot of papers. And I've been involved with, started to be involved with trials of the drugs for COVID, particularly Remdesivir and the UK's recovery trial. And I've been a data safety monitoring committee member for the Oxford Vaccine Group, but not for their COVID vaccine. To start, we'll just be clear about the terminology because that can sometimes be confusing. So firstly, we have the virus. This is a picture of it, the coronavirus, so called because these little spikes here make it look like it's wearing a crown. And so it's called coronavirus, the crown-like virus. And this one is called the Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome Coronavirus 2. And we shorten that to SARS-CoV-2. The disease it causes is this acute respiratory distress syndrome shown on this X-ray here. And we call that COVID-19, which stands for Coronavirus Disease 2019. So the virus and the disease. And we need to think about treatments for both. Do we need something that kills the virus, or do we need something that treats the disease? And as you don't need me to tell you that this virus is probably in every country in the world now. Here's the WHO map from last week showing the spread of the coronavirus around the world and the current hotspots. And you can find yourself and your rate on that map. So what possible treatments could we have for coronavirus? There could be antivirals, so things that attack the virus itself, and I'll talk about those in a minute. I'm listed here in that order. Or maybe we need something that turns off the inflammation that the COVID-19 causes, some anti-inflammatories, and I'll briefly touch on those as well. Here's a picture from a really good review in JAMA of available treatments for COVID-19. And it shows the areas where antivirals might work. So here's the SARS-CoV-2 virus attaching to the ACE2 receptor on the cell, and then it gets into the cell that way. It then gets the RNA out of the cell, hijacks your cell's mechanisms, and then starts making lots of copies of itself, which then go out and infect other cells. So it shows you that chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine will work here. They seem to block the entry of the virus into the cell. The protease inhibitors, Lupinovir or Darunavir, stop making bits of the virus. And the antivirals Ribavirin, Remdesivir, are RNA-dependent polymerase drugs which affect making new bits of RNA for the virus. There are different steps we can affect how we stop the virus. Now let's look at some of those antivirals. First one is a drug that you may be familiar with, Lupinovir and Ritonavir, which is a protease inhibitor which we use to treat people with HIV. As that's being used quite commonly around the world for HIV. We used to use it preferentially for children initially, as it's one of the first suspensions of a PI we could have for children with HIV. So, but it doesn't only affect HIV. There's some in vitro activity against novel coronaviruses and some limited data showing that it can be effective against SARS-CoV-2. Probably it's important to have that antiviral early in the disease within the first 7 days, because later on appears to be very little effect from that. If you've ever used Lupinovir or Ritonavir, you'll know that there are a large number of drug interactions that these drugs have, particularly things like the TB drugs, but many other drugs can interact, either affect the drug itself or be affected by, especially the Ritonavir portion of the drug. So it's quite difficult to use in some circumstances. And there are some side effects. And in one of the trials for COVID-19, 14% of people had to discontinue their therapy because of the side effects they got from this drug. If you're using Lupinovir or Ritonavir, then we often use the University of Liverpool's drug interaction website to help us work out whether it's safe to do so with another drug. And they've just produced this new COVID-19 drug interaction part of their website. And this is the URL here, which you might find useful. So you can put in the antiviral drug you want to use here, Lupinovir, and then you put in the other drugs the patient is taking, and it will then generate for you a list of whether that might be safe to take together or whether there are serious interactions that you need to be aware of. You might find that helpful. So there was some data looking at Lupinovir or Ritonavir in COVID-19, and this has been meta-analysed in this paper here from the Canadian Medical Association Journal. And they found a modest effect, I think, a small decrease in mortality of about maybe 2%, and a reduction in length of stay in intensive care or in hospital stay by a few days. So some effect from that, not huge, but some. And there's a suggestion that maybe combining this with interferon, one of the immune drugs, might improve that. And so this is one of the arms in the WHO trial, which I'll tell you about a little later on. The other thing to say about Lupinovir or Ritonavir is that you shouldn't use it on its own in people who've got HIV. Studies done 10 years ago now show that using this drug on its own in people with HIV did not control their viral load in more than half of the patients, and therefore led to a risk of getting drug resistance. So if you're going to use Lupinovir, Ritonavir for a patient, then you need to check their HIV status beforehand to make sure they're not HIV positive or not already on treatment, because you wouldn't want to give this on its own to someone who is HIV infected and not on treatment. Next, the drug that many people, including the President of the United States, has been talking about for some time, chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine, a very familiar drug for many people around the world because it's an anti-malarial drug. It also has anti-inflammatory properties, which we've used for rheumatoid arthritis and lupus. But as I showed you in that picture, hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine block the viral entry into cells, and so it might be very helpful. The side effects you probably know if you've used it before, particularly concerns about arrhythmias because of prolongation of the QT interval. So in the test tube, it's quite effective at limiting the replication of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And so that's why there's lots of interest in using this to treat people with that. In the early cases, initially in China and then around the world, patients were being given hydroxychloroquine because we thought this might be an effective treatment. That changed very dramatically in May this year, when there were concerns published in 2 studies which suggested that mortality and arrhythmias were increased in those patients who received hydroxychloroquine. And that caused a lot of disquiet amongst people. What's even more worrying, perhaps, is that a few weeks later, many of the authors of these studies withdrew the papers, and they've been retracted from both the Lancet and the New England Journal of Medicine because there was concerns about the data. A number of the authors said they were unable to validate the primary data sources underlying the article, suggesting that the data they seemed to put in didn't seem to match the data that they read in the article. And so both of those papers have been withdrawn. So we don't really know what the real answer from those papers are. Thankfully, another study, this from France, published in the BMJ in May, an observational study of adults with SARS-CoV pneumonia who needed oxygen. And that study essentially showed no effect at all from taking hydroxychloroquine. So they concluded it didn't support their use in these patients. So what next for hydroxychloroquine? Well, it was included in 2 of the large trials for COVID, the recovery trial, a trial in the UK, and that treatment arm is now stopped with hydroxychloroquine, not because of the concerns about toxicity, but because when they looked at the study, they saw there was no benefit in the patients who were receiving hydroxychloroquine in this large trial, and so they stopped using it. WHO have also stopped using hydroxychloroquine in their trial, the Solidarity trial, again, because of some concerns about toxicity and then concerns about having very little effect. Where there is still interest is in prophylaxis here. So if you give hydroxychloroquine to people before they come into contact with a virus or just after they've come into contact, could you somehow prevent them getting on well or getting the infection? And so there are trials running around the world, in the UK and other places, looking at prophylaxis with hydroxychloroquine, and we're still waiting for those results. So the treatment, I think it's probably stopped now, but as prophylaxis, there's still some interest looking at that. Next is a drug you've probably not heard of, and I'd never heard of until this pandemic came around, and that's remdesivir. You can tell it's a new drug because people still refer to its name when it's being developed by the company, GS5734. If you're interested and want to make your own, here you go. I know you shouldn't make your own because it's patented by a drug company. This is the chemical formula for remdesivir. It's an ATP analog, first described in 2016, but used in the Ebola outbreaks in West Africa. So people may have used this in Ebola. It was then found that it also had activity against the coronavirus family, including SARS-CoV-2. And so the company allowed it initially to be used on a compassionate use basis. They just allowed people to use it for very unwell people, and then devised a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial to look at whether it might be effective. The preliminary results of that study are out here in the New England Journal, and these graphs show you the results. So overall, the proportion of people who recovered who got remdesivir compared to placebo was significantly greater. And the time to recovery in people who got remdesivir was 11 days versus 15 days who got the placebo. In patients who were receiving oxygen, that was slightly more obviously beneficial, but people who are then requiring more serious treatments, so ventilation or ECMO, they didn't see any particular difference in those. There was a mortality difference in those who got remdesivir, 7% versus 11.9%, but that did not reach statistical significance. The data is very preliminary, so they hadn't really got many patients over 28 days, and so there will be more data to come out. So because of that, this drug has been made available in some places. So in England, we now have remdesivir available on an early access scheme. And this is one of the slides from the company who are making that available to England. and other parts of the world that's happening. But they're very keen to point out that this is still not a licensed medication. It is an investigational antiviral that's not licensed, and therefore we have to warn patients about that and get their consent to use it. And it's not available for the big recovery trial in the UK, so I think it's rather limited use and around the world, and many people may not be able to get hold of it. It is, however, part of the WHO's trial, so you may be able to get hold of it if you're part of the WHO study. Last and not least, Ribavirin is an antiviral. It's been around for a long time. Many people may have used it for treating hepatitis. And this inhibits viral RNA and again has some effect against the coronaviruses. This, again, in a test tube, it had some effect against SARS-CoV-2, but that's quite limited, and you needed quite a big dose to have any effect. When people looked at the use of Ribavirin for the previous serious coronavirus, so SARS, then, well, the studies that are out there, very few had any positive results, and of those that were done, there's about 4 studies show possible harm, and that's mainly hematological and liver toxicity that affects the bone marrow and the liver. And so the feeling is this is going to have rather limited value for the treatment of COVID-19. So rather disappointingly, we're used to antivirals that have some effect. Our experience with HIV is that they've been hugely effective, but at the moment, nothing really very effective against COVID-19. One interesting thing is to essentially go back 100 years and do what doctors did then, which is to use convalescent plasma, antibodies from people who've recovered from the illness that may help fight the infection by clearing out the virus or helping the immune system get rid of the virus. And so the concept's been around for a long time and been used in various other infections. This is being tried again now. Probably again, this is most beneficial if you give it in the first week of the infection. And for other novel coronaviruses like SARS or severe flu, then systematic review found reduction in mortality when you use convalescent plasma. It's also been used again in Ebola and the outbreak in West Africa a few years ago. There are at least 2 trials I know of at present ongoing looking at convalescent plasma. There's a few case series where they found it to be effective, but these are only up to about 20 patients. They're not very large series, but there's no safety signals with it, and they seem to be potentially helpful. A point to point out here is that the immunoglobulin that you might use, the normal immunoglobulin, will not have antibody against COVID-19 in it at the moment. So few people in the world have got it yet, or certainly all the donors who give blood, which then gets used for immunoglobulin, it's unlikely to have any coronavirus antibody in it for some time, so that won't affect. You have to have the special convalescent plasma from patients who are recovering, ideally fairly recently, because then they have high titers of antibody. So if antivirals are not very effective, what about anti-inflammatories for the huge inflammation that goes on in the lungs in these patients? Well, the obvious one would be steroids, because we know that will cut down the host inflammatory response, and therefore that might give you less lung damage and the acute respiratory distress syndrome that we see. But the experience with previous novel coronaviruses, SARS and the Middle East respiratory virus, MERS, didn't show any improved survival for people who got steroids, but it did show that they continued to excrete the virus for longer, and they had some complications, particularly hyperglycemia. And in flu pneumonia, steroids seem to actually make things worse. So when steroids were included in the recovery trial in the UK, there were lots of people who said that they shouldn't be doing that because it's likely to make people worse. But the researchers quite rightly said, well, we didn't really know, it's a new virus, and they should have that as one of the arms of the trial. And this is the information that came out last week from the recovery trial in the UK about dexamethasone, because what that showed was that dexamethasone significantly reduced the risk of death in the patients who had COVID-19. This data is not in a peer-reviewed journal yet. It got announced in the UK last week because it's such a strong result, and it led to them changing the trial and to standard treatment in the UK. So dexamethasone, 6 milligrams, even by mouth, for 10 days. They gave that to over 2,000 patients with COVID and compared it with over 4,000 patients they'd randomized with COVID in the UK. As you can see here, dexamethasone reduced deaths by 1/3 in patients who are ventilated, so the really unwell patients, and it reduced mortality by 1/5 in patients who are only just receiving oxygen, so unwell enough to need oxygen. The patients who didn't require any respiratory support, so no oxygen or no ventilation, then it didn't seem to give any benefit. But this was quite an impressive finding, and something that surprised a number of people who said it wasn't going to work. So if you want the number needed to treat, then essentially if you give oral dexamethasone to 8 ventilated patients with COVID-19, you prevent 1 death. That's about $60-something to prevent 1 death and to treat 8 people. So it's relatively cheap and an effective and old-fashioned treatment, dexamethasone. So the first drug shown to be effective to improve survival in COVID-19. It's not an antiviral, it's dexamethasone. So if steroids work, well, what about other anti-inflammatories? Because there's this massive cytokine storm, all the immune system firing off different chemicals to cause all sorts of inflammation. Should we be trying to block other bits of that with the new agents we have, something like interleukin-1 receptor or interleukin-6 receptor blockade? Certainly in China, this has become a common thing to use because of case series there which showed marked improvement in patients who got interleukin-6 receptor blockade. So again, trials are going on. These are part of the recovery trial and other trials around the UK, and we're waiting to find them. These drugs, however, are very expensive because they're monoclonal antibodies. They're expensive to produce, and I guess will be way out of the budget of many countries around the world to be able to use these sort of agents. So I've mentioned a number of times the Solidarity trial by the WHO, and this is currently the trial options. So the options are remdesivir, the new antiviral, Lupinovir, Ritonavir, the HIV drug, or that combined with interferon to see if that improves the outcome. And the WHO are very clear about this, that we should be trying to think of these, if you want to use these medicines, you should try to do it as part of a trial, and they warn against people giving them as they're unproven, and they worry about people just using them without thinking very hard about it. So if you can use them as part of a trial, that would be the best thing. If you can't, then I guess you need to talk with a colleague and say, do you think this is the right thing to do? Because we're very much on the edge of our understanding here. So that's enough about antivirals. The other half of the talk is supposed to be about vaccines. If antivirals are not very effective, then perhaps we should be putting all our effort into preventing the infection by using vaccines. So the WHO reckon there's probably over 120 vaccines proposed so far around the world, and they're trying to keep tabs on all of those, trying to work out where they are, which ones look effective, and therefore which ones that could be recommended across the globe for people to try and prevent COVID-19. So how would you go about making a vaccine? So here's a very pretty picture of the coronavirus. This is SARS-CoV-2, and you can see it's made up of these spike proteins, and these are the spikes that make up the crown that give it a coronavirus name. And these spike proteins here are the bits your immune system recognizes because they're on the outside of the virus, and so they can recognize that and use that as the target to then start trying to fight the virus for your immune system. Inside the virus here is the RNA, which codes all the genetic material for the virus, and again we might be able to use that. So what sort of vaccines could we make? Well, you could try and somehow attenuate this virus and make it a live attenuated vaccine, No one's managing to do that at the moment, and so nobody's keen on giving a live SARS-CoV-2 virus to anybody, and I can understand that for now. So that leaves us some other options. Well, you could just kill the virus and then use the whole virus as your vaccine. And we do that in lots of vaccines. So the inactivated polio vaccine, the hepatitis A vaccine, those are whole viruses which are being killed and then used as the basis for a vaccine. So in China, they've got an inactivated vaccine, which they've used in an animal model. It gave some protection against severe disease, so it's quite impressive. It produces antibody when they've given it to people in a human study, so it's immunogenic. What we don't know yet is whether it protects against actual disease. Alternatively, you could take just a spike protein and use that as the basis of your vaccine, because that's the bit your immune system recognizes and uses to fight the virus. And a number of vaccines are using this spike protein, one of which is the one developed in Oxford in the UK here. And what they've done is they've taken that spike protein, they know the RNA for it, and they've put it into a special vaccine vector. So they have a chimpanzee adenovirus, which they've modified so that it doesn't cause disease in people, but it essentially what works is just a Trojan horse. You can take this thing into the body, it presents bits of a virus, and in this case, here's the spike protein from COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2 on that. And so you then inject that, and your body then recognizes the spike protein and starts producing an immune response to it. So they've gone through phase 1 and 2 trials, and there's a big phase 3 trial at the moment, trying to see whether this vaccine will produce protection. Certainly seems immunogenic, produces protection, produces immune response, but is that immune response going to protect you? Alternatively, the really exciting things, I think the new things are people using the RNA itself or a DNA from that RNA and using that as the basis of your vaccine. This is quite a new idea. We haven't used that widely. It's been around for a while, but there are no widespread vaccine programs yet based on this. And you essentially take that RNA or DNA and inject it into the patient. It then gets taken up into the human cells, your own cells, and then means that you start producing that spike protein yourself on your own cells. The body then recognizes those as abnormal, and you produce your immune response to that. So instead of having a virus vector, you just use your own cells to produce that spike protein. There's a big study from Imperial College in London looking at this sort of vaccine and a number of others around the world. All of them are interesting and all recruiting, but we don't know yet whether they're going to be effective. So what will a vaccine do? We know what we'd like it to do. We'd like it to stop people getting COVID-19. That's the whole point, isn't it? What will it do? Well, that's what these studies are all about. Will it help people produce antibody against the virus? Well, yes, it does. We've seen that already. So we can produce antibody against the virus. But what does that do? Will that protect you against the virus and stop you getting it completely? We don't really know. It'd be great if it did, wouldn't it? Or may it just prevent severe infection, particularly in the vulnerable people, patients who've got particular risk for this, and preventing severe disease would be a real bonus, wouldn't it? So maybe it'll do that, and that would be great if it did that. There are some fears that perhaps it might make you worse. So there are some infections where if you've already primed the immune system with a vaccine, so something like dengue or in the old-fashioned RSV vaccine, if the immune system has seen this virus with a vaccine and then you came across the virus in real life, you've got a much more severe case of the disease. Will that happen with this inflammatory illness that happens after COVID-19? We don't know. But that's what the studies are for, to see whether we can induce protection or not. So these studies are running around the world, in the UK, and certainly in Brazil, Kenya, and other places around the world, not looking just at immunogenicity, but actually trying to say, will this vaccine stop people getting the virus or stop people getting ill with the virus? And that's still going to take a while for them to do. Now, mostly, it takes about 8 years to develop and get a vaccine out to market. At the moment, we've had, 18 weeks to get this far, and we're already in a phase 3 study for a number of these vaccines. So doing incredibly quickly, but whether they're actually going to do what we want it to do, we'll have to wait and see what the results show us. But what about using other vaccines? Things we already know. So BCG is a really interesting vaccine because it produces a very broad immune response that protects not just against tuberculosis and leprosy, but other infections too. And children who get BCG seem to have a better survival rate in parts of the world because it gives it a better immune response. So there's been some link between the population coverage of a country and the COVID-19 incidence. So there's a suggestion that maybe BCG gives some non-specific immunity. At the moment, there's about 5, I think, trials underway looking at that already. We don't know if that's true or not. The WHO have come out and said, well, there's no evidence yet. There's trials looking at that, but we haven't answered the question yet. At the moment, don't use BCG to try and protect people against COVID, but do keep using BCG because we know it stops babies getting tuberculosis. So if you normally use it, then keep on using it, and maybe there'll be some non-specific benefit, but we don't know about that yet. If you want to know a bit more about the vaccines, then there's a really good article here in the British Medical Journal, which you should be able to get online, which summarises where we're up to and just puts it very clearly. So which vaccine will make it successfully through clinical trials? It's too early to tell. In an ideal world, we'd have more than one vaccine that's safe and effective because no single vaccine will suit everybody. Access will be particularly challenging for low-income countries where financial support will be essential. This paper points out that most vaccines are quite expensive. Thankfully, Gavi and the Gates Foundation are already looking at this to say, if we get a vaccine that works, how can we make sure that it's available to everybody and not just those people who've got lots of money in the world? So I'm going to start winding up soon. The things that I've told you are this, that the antivirals and vaccines, at the moment, we're still waiting for an answer, but the answer came up for something else, and that dexamethasone is the first drug that's been shown to improve survival in COVID-19 for patients who are either in oxygen or ventilated. The antivirals, there's some limited effect or limited availability of them, and it's best probably that you look at those as part of a trial. And the vaccines are in development, but those studies are ongoing to prove they really work for us. So what would you do if you meet a patient with COVID-19 tomorrow? I guess you do what all good doctors do. You take a history and examine the patient and then try and look after them the best you can with what you've got. So firstly, decide if they need oxygen, because that's the most useful treatment we have available. Think about whether this could be something else. So even in the UK, we've been caught out by people who we thought might have COVID-19, but actually had pneumocystis pneumonia because they had HIV, which is undiagnosed. So in countries where HIV is common, I think, could this be pneumocystis and something else, and look at the HIV status. For patients who need oxygen, then dexamethasone 6 milligrams once a day is likely to improve their outcome. If you think they need an antiviral, then the best thing to do is try to be part of a trial to do that, so we can all learn about those things. If you can't access a trial, then talk to a colleague, ask them advice, discuss it together, say, is this the right thing to do? What should we do here? What's available to us? What's the best thing I can do for my patient? Those are hard decisions sometimes, aren't they? The last few months of the pandemic, I think I felt a bit like this. This is a deep sea diver, and it is not an illustration of the personal protective equipment we've been wearing in the UK or other places. but it's a picture which shows what it feels like, I think, to be working during the coronavirus pandemic. We're wearing equipment which is unfamiliar to us. It's rather uncomfortable and makes it difficult to do what we normally do. We're often in places where we haven't normally been, or we're seeing things that we're not used to seeing. And that can be very difficult, and some people can feel rather overwhelmed by all the anxiety and the unfamiliarity of what's going on. And so we can feel like this diver out of our depth, really struggling to know what the best thing to do is. But if anyone knows anything about diving, you should never do it on your own. You should always have somebody with you. Here's a diving buddy next to his friend, making sure he's safe and doing the right things. And there's a team up here supporting them. And I guess that's something we've learned to do over the last few weeks and months, particularly, to look out for our colleagues, to be a buddy for them when they need protecting, to rely on them to look out for us, and to look at our support team. As a Christian, I've been really aware of those people who have been my support team, people who pray for me, people who've been asking how I'm getting on, and making sure that, that I know that they're praying and looking after me. And to know that I have someone working alongside me, the Lord Jesus, a buddy, someone who's with us in those difficult times, even when we feel alone. One of the members of my home group from church went to a event at Chester Cathedral very recently, and they had some meditations there, which she found very helpful, and shared one of those prayers from that, which I think would be very helpful for us. I'm not going to read this for you now, because I think it's something that perhaps you need to look at and remember when you can't remember that God is with you. This would be something to have a look at. My slides will be available for you after the talk. They can be sent out to you, so you can use this prayer on a day when you need to remember that God is with you and know that he is there and he is that buddy who's working with you. That's probably a good place for me to stop and hand back to Peter.
Wow, well, thank you very much indeed, Andrew. That's incredibly comprehensive, wide-ranging. I've learnt many things, and I'm sure those listening have as well. So thank you for so masterfully bringing all the threads together for us. So let's move to the questions now. And the first question, Andrew, is about dexamethasone and steroids. Are the good results we see with dexamethasone only for dexamethasone, or are the results to suggest that other members of the corticosteroid class would also be helpful?
That's a great question, and we were discussing this yesterday. So in the trial, they just used dexamethasone. You would imagine that other corticosteroids are likely to have the same effect. We were talking, especially with our neonatal colleagues, and they worry about using dexamethasone in newborn babies because there are concerns about that. So they would probably use hydrocortisone in a neonate, on the understanding that it's likely to be a similar anti-inflammatory effect. But we only know that dexamethasone worked because that's the one they used in the trial. You might imagine that other corticosteroids are likely to have a similar effect. Okay,
that makes good sense. Now, someone's asking here, given that we never found a vaccination for MERS, for Ebola, even for HIV, why are so many countries hoping to get one for COVID-19? Is it truly realistic? You said there are over 120 trials going on. I heard someone say the other day on one of these webinars that the quickest time to get a vaccine was about 5 years. So really, what are the prospects and how hard should we be looking?
That, again, fantastic question. And everybody's desperate to have a vaccine, aren't they? Because this is swept around the world and caused so many deaths, isn't it? We need to find something. So MERS and SARS didn't have quite such a global problem or so many deaths, and so I think hasn't had quite so much effort put into it. This has been a massive international effort now, isn't it? So that, I guess we're at the crunch time, aren't we? We know that the bits of the virus, like the spike protein, can produce immune responses in people injected with it. So the vaccines produce an immune response, but now it's a critical time. Does that immune response stop you getting ill or stop you getting very ill? That's what we're about to find out. And they think we may have some early information from the Oxford trial by about August or September. But that depends a little bit on what rate of coronavirus infection is in the UK. Thankfully, we're dropping down our rates now, but that's not to say we won't get another spike. In other parts of the world, it's going up at the moment. And so Brazil and Kenya, I know that there are trials going there. So you're likely to get information from those sort of trials. So it certainly produces antibody against it, which is the first thing you'd want as a vaccine. Whether that protects you or not, that's the $64,000 question, and we're waiting for a few more months before we know that.
Yeah. So quite a technical question here on the use of Lupinovir and Ribavirin. It's challenging, isn't it, all these syllables, especially for a surgeon like me. But what's the recommendation, Andrew, for patients with HIV/AIDS on heart regime with a different protease inhibitor?
The recommendation is just stick on your current heart regime. If you're on a protease inhibitor, then keep going. In the UK, we wouldn't add Lupinovir, Ritonavir to another regime. We'd just leave them on the regime they're on.
Now, if a vaccine is developed within a year, how likely do you think it is that poorer countries will have use of it within 2 years, even being optimistic? You talked about the Gates Foundation and there being many people wanting to invest in this, but what's your thought about that?
I don't know. I'd love to have been a fly on the wall for the Gavi Gates meeting in the UK a month or so ago where they discussed this. People they're making all the right noises, aren't they? From up front, Gavi and the Gates Foundation are saying we want this for everybody, not just for those who can afford it. Certainly the Oxford vaccine and their partner, who's AstraZeneca, are not saying they're going to make this available cost price and not trying to sell this to everybody, but actually just make it because they think it's important to do so. I think other companies might do the same. So you'd hope there'll be the case. And there's a really good track record now with Gavi and the Gates Foundation making life-saving vaccines like pneumococcal conjugate vaccine available for parts of the world where they couldn't afford it otherwise. So they've got a pretty good track record, but this will be a massive thing, won't it? How many doses you need to immunize almost everybody on the planet, wouldn't you?
Indeed. Well, we know that that COVID-19 is not a simple disease. They said it was a respiratory virus to start with. We now know it's multi-organ system. What about the long-term complications? Is it going to be like HIV, where there's a whole generation of problems, or is it simply too early to tell?
That's a great question, and that's where I, as a children's doctor, don't know. So certainly there are some lung damage. I think bronchiectasis and other things have been found in patients who've had severe COVID, and so that may leave them some issues long term. That's likely to be the case. In children, we've been seeing this very bizarre hyperinflammatory syndrome, which in the UK we call PIMS-TS, polyinflammatory syndrome, or in America they call it MISC, multi-inflammatory syndrome linked to coronavirus. And those children get massive inflammation as well. And some of them then develop coronary artery aneurysms, a bit like in Kawasaki disease, although it doesn't seem to be quite like Kawasaki disease. So there's a new strange inflammatory syndrome in children. If you want me to talk about that, then you have to invite me back another day, Peter, to come and talk about that one, because that's another topic on itself. So there may be some long-term complications, but different in adults than it is in children.
Thanks. Now, someone's asked about another drug I've never heard of before called Fevour. Yeah, what about that?
I left it out because because it's not in any of the big trials yet. There are people who've used it a bit, but I'm not sure there's a lot of data available yet on that. If you look at the JAMA review I put a reference to, it tells you about it in there.
Okay, so some more reading for listeners there. Now, someone's asking about the dangers of convalescent plasma. Mm-hmm. Are there dangers, particularly perhaps for people who have been exposed to other dangerous diseases? That's one question. And then a supplementary on that, is there any particular concern for Christians taking blood products into us? So two parts.
Okay, good question. Okay, so convalescent plasma, so all blood products. Yes, of course, we worry about potential for blood-borne virus transmission. And of course, hepatitis and HIV are those things. So you have to be very good at screening for those in the donors that you're getting your plasma from. So that all depends on how good your blood transfusion service is at providing those things. And we've all had bad experiences where that wasn't good in places around the world, including the UK and others. But now people screen very carefully to make sure that these things are safe. So that depends on who's providing the plasma for you, isn't it? And you should do that. Are there issues with Christians having blood transfusions? Personally, I would think I wouldn't have a problem with that. But I know there are some people who sometimes are concerned about that, but that's not an issue that I would feel is an issue for many Christians.
There's a question here about the private public research things. Should the WHO be in some way controlling or coordinating all the vaccine experiments and research that's going on, or is it best just to allow private companies to get on with it? And I guess there's two questions about that. Firstly, isn't there a lot of financial waste through everyone doing their own thing? But secondly, also, is there a danger that a vaccine will be produced and then, driven by the profit motive, won't be available to those who most need it or for big numbers?
Yeah, always tricky situations. So much of the vaccine development is done by researchers, so universities and other research institutions around the world who are really good at those things and design the trials and make sure that these vaccines are safe and effective. What they're not good at then is producing large amounts of that vaccine. That's where we need the vaccine companies to come in, and they're already gearing up on the understanding that one of these vaccines is likely to be effective, and therefore they need to be ready to go in however many months' time. And people say, yes, it works, they need to suddenly crank out huge numbers. So they're already getting their factories set up ready to go for those things. So you do have to have a partnership because no one can do all the stuff. WHO can advise what are the sensible vaccines to use, but that would not be, they can't control all of those things, can they? Having lots of different companies doing it is probably better, as the article in the BMJ suggested, that one size is unlikely to fit all, isn't it? We're going to need a variety, if we can, of vaccines, because some might be better in some places or for some people than others. You never know. You hope that with this massive pandemic that people would agree that they were going to make these vaccines available at a cost that is affordable for everybody. Whether that will happen or not, we'll wait and find out. So we'd hope and pray that it would be available to everybody who actually needs it and not just those who can pay.
So there are a couple of questions here relating to who should be vaccinated, or particularly who should be vaccinated first if there's a limited supply. So as a pediatrician, given that those younger than 19 are mostly mild and death is extremely uncommon, would you consider not vaccinating them in order to focus on high-risk groups or close contacts?
Yeah, so who would get it first? Many people would say healthcare workers should be the first people to get it because they're the ones who have a high risk And it's something like about 20% of UK health workers are antibody positive now, much lower in our children's hospital, only about 6 or 7%. So healthcare workers would be in line to get that. And then the people you really want to protect are the over 70s, aren't they? But they may be the ones where the vaccine struggles to work best. So it's difficult, isn't it? So depending on what the vaccine's like, yes, you'd pick the high risk people first, wouldn't you? And children would be, you're quite right, very low down that risk because they seem to be about half as likely to contract the virus and the disease as other people. Again, we don't understand why that is, but that's the way it is.
And then perhaps the final question, is it really true that the University of Oxford is very close to developing a vaccine and already has orders from France? Do you have any special inside knowledge that we don't have as people listening to the news?
I could email my friend who's running the trial, but so that they have at University of Oxford have this spike protein chimpanzee adenovirus vaccine, which is in phase 3 clinical trial at the moment. They're offering it to healthcare workers in the UK to be part of the trial, and it's also out in Brazil using that. So it's in phase 3 trial. Yes, it's there, and they think they might have results by August or September. And they're working with AstraZeneca, who are getting their factories geared up to go, that if it is effective, then they would be able to start producing large volumes of it quickly. But we've got to show that it works first.
Okay. And perhaps just one bonus question, because we need to wind up, but someone's asked, since some of these patients are having problems with blood coagulation, is there any evidence looking at anticoagulants like heparin or others and their effectiveness in improving morbidity or mortality?
That's a really good question, and it is right. And the answer is I don't know, but I think there are studies looking at anticoagulants because thrombosis seems to be a big risk with this virus. You're right.
And so you've been listening to Dr. Andy Riordan speaking about treatments and vaccines for COVID-19. What prospects, and he's given us an amazing overview of all the research that's happening at the moment and exactly where we are, and overall it's quite a challenging picture. So it remains for me really just to thank again our speaker, Dr. Andy Riordan, for such a fantastic presentation, for all of you who've been watching on Zoom and on Facebook, and we look forward to seeing you again soon on ICMDA webinars. Thank you and God bless you.